we're doing this thing called service design, and he started explaining it. It was like, oh my God, this is how I think, and there's a whole methodology behind this. And I think I've since heard that's quite true for a lot of people. Service design is a bit of a sort of fractal in its nature. Every time you zoom in, you see the same complexity again. In Helsinki last year at the Service Design Network conference, I was in this room of 750 people plus another several hundred online. I really felt, wow, okay, this is a real thing. I also hear of a role for service designers to be coming in a horizontal way and gluing things together. Management of large companies or organizations is still a hangover of the Industrial Revolution. It's really an assembly line still. All this stuff hangs together, and if it doesn't hang together as a coherent whole, it's really problematic. You're actually dealing with a human being who's got fears and anxieties and all those kinds of things. How do you actually shape that change and help people kind of not just freak out?
Very excited to see you again, Andy, because I have heard that there is a bit of a secret project that has been happening in the past months.
There is, indeed.
So what's the secret?
We have spent most of this year writing the second edition of our book, Service Design, from Insight to Implementation, and we being Ben Reason and Lavrans, Løvlie, and myself. So it is coming out on October the 21st is the official launch date.
That's the book that brought many people to service design, including myself. It made me discover that there is a field around that. Before we jump into the second edition, how did that first edition come out, and what was the needs that it covered back then?
The origin story of it is actually me teaching. I became interested in sort of organizational design, actually, when I was the head of school in media arts in the College of Fine Arts in Sydney at UNSW. We were having a faculty restructure. I remember thinking this is a design process, and yet we were all sort of sitting in a meeting room reading out sheets of A4 text to each other. And I thought, why aren't we on the whiteboard here? So I started getting into that. And then I'd known Ben for some time, and I went and visited him. It must have been around 2001 because Live Work had only just started. And he said, oh, we're doing this thing called service design. And he started explaining it. And I met Chris Downs that day too, one of the other founders of Live Work. And it was like, oh my God, this is how I think, and there's a whole methodology behind this. And I think that's quite true for a lot of people who've read the book or been taught by me. So I sort of, over a few years, segued towards that. And then I started teaching it, and I was teaching, where now you and I are colleagues. In 2009, I started the service design track there of the Masters of Design. I've been sort of talking to Ben and Lavrans and Chris saying, when are you guys going to write the book on service design? Because you kind of wrote the book on service design, right? You were the pioneers of it. And hey, I'm going to get around to it sometime. And then I pitched it to Lou Rosenfeld and said, listen, I'm going to write the book on this. And I was originally going to do it in that sort of journalistic style where you go to lots of different agencies and talk to them about their practice and sort of pull that all together into one book. And at some point in that process, Ben and Lavrans said, okay, look, we'll write it with you. So that's how that started. It actually took us quite a long time to write. We went way over our deadline. 3 people writing a book is not 3 times as fast, that's for sure. It sort of takes twice the amount of time. And so that was really, for me, I wanted to sort of capture that stuff. There wasn't really a book out. This is Service Design Thinking hadn't come out at that point. There were a couple of other books that had come out, more with a sort of academic look to it, but there wasn't really a sort of very practical guide to doing it. And so that's what I was looking for. And I was looking for it because I was teaching it. And when you teach something, that is quite complex, service design is a bit of a sort of fractal in its nature, that you kind of, every time you zoom in, you kind of see the same complexity again. And that zooming in and out is a sort of big feature of the way I think about all of that stuff. And because everything's related to everything else in that systems way, it's actually quite hard to work out where's the best place to start and end and sort of sequence this. And I had to do that quite a lot for my teaching because, teaching is kind of a linear process. And then we had to do that for the book too. So that's kind of how it came about. It was scratching my own itch. And for them, I think they sort of wanted to capture some of their knowledge as well and put it out there.
I would imagine, once you publish a book that works really well, that you're quite happy with it and that you would move on to kind of like the next book. Yeah. So why come back to it if it worked already so well?
I've got the sort of beginnings, some first draft parts of a book around design leadership, which is obviously also my sort of main day job, is to coach design leaders now. And whilst I was talking to Lou about it, actually, he said, well, have you ever thought about doing a second edition of the service design book because it's sold well, sort of consistently? And I was a little bit torn because I was like, exactly that. Right? I've kind of done that, right? I want to move on to the next thing. But Ben and Lavrans and I started having a conversation about it, and it was really interesting. I really enjoyed conversations with them. And obviously, when we wrote the first edition, service design had been around for a while. So it came out, that book, I think, officially in 2013, maybe 14. But we started writing it in like 2011. And so, it's sort of with nearly 15 years of hindsight, looking back on it, we had a very different perspective. Because when we first wrote the first book, there was still quite a lot of, here are some interesting initial case studies. Here's what we think service design can do and offer. But now, 15 years or 12, 15 years later, you get to look back on that and go, wow, okay, for a start, this discipline has really grown. I really felt that in Helsinki last year at the Service Design Network conference. I was in this room of 750 people plus another, I can't remember how many, sort of several hundred online, thinking, wow, okay, this is a real thing. And, this has really grown. And loads and loads of case studies, right? So all those conference presentations, all the stuff that, any of us have worked on over that time. And also the kind of where the utopian hopefulness, it's the reality of actually doing it. We had all of that to draw upon. So that was kind of really interesting. And as we started to write a little document, or just kind of looking at here of why should we write a second book, it became quite interesting. So we wrote it.
From reading the preview that you shared, one thing that really stuck with me is this maturing bit. So what is one of the main themes where you say, oh, these are predictions or things that we talked about in the first book that we then took a bit of another take on it, because now there is more maturity in that field?
In the last chapter of the first edition had this kind of future-looking chapter. It's called The Challenges Facing Service Design. They were mostly around the sort of triple bottom line stuff, sort of economic challenge of how can we do things differently and make the business case for it. There was some stuff around the role that services can play in sustainability, particularly as back then we were looking at that shift from product ownership to having access to services. And then there was the sort of societal challenges of it. So when we were looking back on that, we were not quite saying, wouldn't it be great if service designers around the world? But there was a little bit of that aspect of this could offer those three sort of issues quite a lot. I think in some cases it's been quite successful, right? So certainly if you look at government digital services in the UK and all of the work that's been done there, which has a very strong service design aspect, because those things are services, right? And what was in the States until it got dismantled by Doge and Elon Musk. And in other public services, it's had quite a lot of impact in public services, and it's really found its place there. And those people who've worked in that had to face the rigor of trying to shift large bureaucratic organizations into that direction. It had less impact on the sustainability aspect than it could have done. There was a big thing in the late 2000s around the sharing economy and that whole idea of a book by Rachel Botsman called What's Mine Is Yours. And it was all about this kind of shift to sharing the economy and the way that would reduce consumption. And that just didn't happen, right? The dark side of it is the large organizations became sort of very like Airbnb and Uber have sort of got this shadow side to them too. And then, of course, the sort of massive rise of digital in general. So the smartphones had not been around that long since when we first wrote the book. And so, that whole economy, that whole sort of digital scale up thing and everything that's kind of problematic with big tech now, none of that was there kind of back then. And I think we were a little bit naive, perhaps, or a little bit blue-eyed, we say in German, wide-eyed about the idea that this was going to have more impact there. And, I still think the economic stuff is still quite valid too. So that chapter actually is one of the chapters that's been quite heavily revised to take a look at all of those challenges and sort of what we got wrong, but also how most of those challenges are still there, unfortunately, too.
The world of design has changed a lot since this first edition, and a lot has happened where many people will know design today as product design, digital design. So is service still relevant in all of that? Do we still need that aspect of the ecosystem?
Yeah, more than ever, actually. The rise of product design or product management and product leadership or product-led organizations has obviously been the big thing in the last, I mean, arguably that sort of, I mean, other people will say, oh, I was doing it in the kind of 90s, but the way it's sort of been packaged, if you like, I would argue it's 15 to 17 years old at best, and I meet a lot of product people and they're product leaders and they've got sort of 7 years experience or something like that. And that makes them relatively experienced in that world. So I think that one of the things we noticed as we were talking about it, especially one of the very early conversations we had about the second edition, was a couple of things. Design thinking sort of came and went, like the sort of boom of that happened. And it was one of the reasons when we were looking at the book, actually Lavrans said, I want to pull loads of stuff out. I want us to make it a thinner edition rather than a fatter edition, knowing that we were going to kind of write more stuff. And one of the things that we looked at was quite a lot of methods in there. And we took out some of that because, they're well known now. Back then, they weren't. There was a lot of methods that are kind of basically human-centered design methods, which are sort of common parlance now. So that kind of happened. And then sort of had the bust, if you like, the boom and bust of design thinking. I think product design did a very good job of creating a structure that was appealing to organizations and management. And I would argue it's a sort of industrial way of thinking, right? People still talk about shipping, and, in the bad places, we talk about feature factories and stuff. It's still got a lot of industrial language about it, which I think is actually problematic because it sort of sets up this assembly line process. You have kind of feature teams and stuff kind of works its way through. And it's sort of like these little mini factories. And, what happened with Airbnb, for example, so Brian Chesky had this moment of like, I don't really understand my company anymore. I don't really understand how we work. I've got all these little factories kind of working away. I don't really get how they work or what they do, which is one of the reasons why there was this kind of service blueprinting process that went on there to actually try and kind of map it all out again. And yet I remember having conversations with Airbnb folks as we were doing the research for the first edition around how they saw themselves as a service company. So they had gone through this kind of whole cycle. So while product has done a lot of stuff that, has brought a lot of really great stuff and organized things that were otherwise chaotic and brought structure and frameworks, it's also quite often siloed the process again. So, I know lots of situations of feature teams who are working on different bits of the same app, let alone different touch points, like different apps for like a bank or something, but literally the same thing. And there's inconsistencies between them and disagreements and stuff because they are siloed. They're working in their little kind of teams and they don't have enough sense of the ecosystem. So I also hear of a role for service designers to be coming in a horizontal way and kind of trying to create that coherent, gluing things together experience again. And, the cynical part of me is like, well, we've been having those conversations for the past 15 years. What's going on here? But, I think what's going on is that industrial way of thinking, that structured way of thinking that's siloed, appealing to organizations because that's how they run anyway, right? And because management of organizations, of large companies or organizations, is still a hangover of the Industrial Revolution that, we call them departments and stuff, but, it's really an assembly line still. And you still have this separation of the kind of workers and the management. And so I think the language of all that stuff and the structural stuff meant that companies could kind of fall back into bad old habits a little bit and feel comfortable. Like, oh, okay, now we can do that sort of command and control top down thing. We don't have to do this more sort of agile and kind of more collective structure anymore. And so as we were looking through sort of what has changed and what hasn't, one of the things that we noticed is a lot of the methods got sort of taken up and, absorbed into design thinking and all the rest of it. Two fundamental things we felt got a little bit kind of lost. One was, or forgotten. One was this idea that really almost everything is a service. So certainly all of the digital stuff we use as services. Slack, Netflix, well, none of us own our software, right? We all pretty much own subscriptions to stuff now too. When those things are services, because if their servers are down, the clue is in the word of server, right? If their servers are down, you open up Slack, it doesn't work, right? You just got those little placeholder boxes. There's this whole infrastructure there that makes that thing work, that you have access to, and that's a very service mindset. And the service mindset bit of it is that it's an ecosystem. All this stuff hangs together, and if it doesn't hang together as a coherent whole, it's really problematic. Apple does this generally very, very well. But, iCloud is still a bit clunky. It's quite often, and it doesn't just work in the way it should, and people know it. But you see it a lot when those things don't join up. We have airline experiences or HR experiences or insurance or any of those things where it's still really fractured and a mess. So that ecosystem view sort of got lost in that. People forget that they're designing services and not products. That doesn't change, but it's actually something that's connected to everything else, hence the ecosystem. And then the other aspect of service design, which is a really essential part of its thinking, is this front stage, backstage thing. So it's not just about the stuff that the end user or customer sees and experiences. It's still always about the organization's ability to deliver and support that. So those are the tools and systems and processes and employee experiences that enable that front stage experience and the interplay between the two. And that bit got a bit forgotten too. I think product is kind of focused mainly on that front stage single touch point thing. And a lot of the other stuff, which is essential, got lost.
Is there anything else that has changed in this new edition that you think people should know before buying it?
Yeah, I mean, we wrote a whole chapter about organizational change, actually, and that was the bit that was missing in the first book. And we sort of touched on it, but we didn't really touch on it nearly enough, which is, as anyone who's a practicing service designer knows, ends up being, 80, 90% of the work, which is because all the stuff I just talked about, right, the front stage, backstage thing, if you start to try and renew a service because it's kind of rare to launch something brand new from scratch and design it from end to end and just launch it. Even if you're launching a new airline or something, airlines already exist and they sit into the context of airport, the rest of it, right? So you're always in a historical context. And so to do that involves really asking an organization to change. And my experience when I was working at Fjord was often clients would come to us with a customer experience thing and they would say, we want to improve our customer experience. We're like, yeah, sure, of course you do. Let's do all the work on that. And then here are our concepts. And then they would have this moment of, in order to deliver those, we really have to rethink the way we work and, and our employee experience. And so quite often an EX piece of work would come after the CX piece of work, which is the sort of necessary preconditions for them to actually be able to do the things that we originally looked at in the CX piece of work. So all of that stuff, and I know this is a big thing for you, right? How do you get stakeholders on board? And on the human level, there's I think we wrote, there's a piece where it says, I think we called it, managers are people too. So this idea that, you're actually dealing with a human being who's got fears and anxieties and all those kinds of things. How do you actually shape that change and help people kind of not just freak out at the organizational level and have that sort of systems effect of the organizational sort of antibodies just kicking in and going, no, we don't want this change. Because without that, you don't end up actually launching a service and you just designed a concept and it never actually goes live because everyone just shuts it down. So that's a whole new chapter, actually. The other thing that we did was we got some really, really nice input from other people, from external people with case studies. Indy Young's shared her wisdom around thinking styles in the research bit. And that was an area where we sort of went, well, you should just go and speak to, read the work of Indy Young, Steve Portical, Sam Ladner, Erica Hall, those kinds of people. Because if you want to do research, they're the people to go and talk to. So it was great to have Indy contribute. And other people have contributed other parts. Got to update almost all the case studies. There's a couple of the older ones still there, which was good. There's the case study that we started the original book with for this insurance company called Jens. And we had this really nice thing because back then it was, the beginnings of them changing and what, how was this going to work and some initial ideas, it has sort of this big kind of radical idea and then some smaller things. And Lavrans got the chance to go back and talk to the now ex-CEO, who was the then CEO of Jens, and I think the head of marketing, and sort of go, okay, so 10 years later or 15 years later, how much of that stuff remained in the organization and how much of it, couldn't you do? And it's kind of really fascinating because they're currently some now just starting to do stuff that, they were talking about back then all that time ago because it's now possible or the organizational will is there. So that's been really good. So to update all of those, to have lots of new case studies in there, particularly some of the ones around the organizational stuff. That's all in there. And then On the spring cleaning front, we went through everything. It's a very weird experience to write a second edition. If you've ever had like a mark on your wall in an apartment, and gone, I'm just going to touch up that mark, and you scuffed it with something. And then you go, oh, that stands out a bit. I better paint a bit more around it to blend it in. And then you start having that moment, I'm just going to paint the whole wall. And then you sort of go, well, I might as well just paint the whole apartment whilst I'm at it. It's really hard to resist doing that. On the one hand, to just rewrite the whole thing, and how much to sort of leave as a kind of historical document, if you like. There was some stuff there which was, I thought, I don't know whether to rewrite this or not. I sort of feel like it captures a moment in time, or it captures some stuff, and I sort of want to leave it intact and not update absolutely everything. And at the same time, I had this sort of opposite experience where sometimes I was reading stuff that we had written, and I was like, oh, we actually really put that well when we wrote that. Like, it was really clearly explained, that thing. And over the years of me sort of explaining, I've gradually sort of made it more messy and less understandable. And it was quite useful to go back to the sort of edited prose that we had written and go, yeah, actually, that's quite good. And we had frequent moments where we'd have a sentence or something. Oh, that's a really great sentence. We don't know who wrote it, because it was a very, very kind of blended process. And in my head, I'm like, I think you wrote that, didn't you, Lavrans? And he's like, no, I think you wrote that. So there's a lot of that kind of went through. There's a lot of tweaking of things.
Sounds like you guys had also kind of a lovely moment going back through the book and seeing, oh, we were smart back then, which is also kind of a nice
Yeah,
moment.
we've got more stupid since.
So obviously, to me, this book had a very lovely impact on my life. It's the book that made me realize that the thing that I was trying to do had a name. It gives you the sense of direction. Suddenly it opens a new world. So thanks so much for writing that first edition. And I hope that many people will have the pleasure to discover the second edition. Maybe it's going to be their first experience with that book. So if they want to discover that book, how can they get it in a way that supports you, the writers, also in the best way?
Thank you. You write a book and you put it out there, and it's sort of it's a painful process. So the actual sort of writing of the book bit is only half the work. All the sort of edits and tweaking of stuff at the end, I call it the sweeping up. I mean, you'll know this. It's painful. The finishing up and then the kind of marketing and stuff of the book is the other half of the work. And so once it's done, I had this with my PhD. You sort of like, oh, okay, I've birthed that thing now, and sort of move on. And I hadn't been to that many of the conferences. I'd been doing other stuff and all those kinds of things over time, and sort of engaged with the service design community, but not sort of putting myself front and center there at all. And we often talk about impact as designers and want to have the societal impact and all those things. But the ripple effect is really profound sometimes of smaller things. So, the fact that you say, well, it changed the course of my life, and obviously it ended up that I taught you and now we're working together, is great. When I went to the conference in Helsinki, and the book's sold over to 22,000 copies over the time, which is not like, it's not like it's compared to a million bestseller of a novel or something, but it's a lot of people when you think about it who have bought that. And being at the conference and realizing, oh my God, everyone knows, or most people here know who I am, and they know of the book. That was a kind of an amazing moment, because it's not something I really think about very consciously. And, it's obviously nice for the ego, but it was actually sort of nice to think of that ripple effect and how much it had helped people move into that career. So that's extremely satisfying. And I would say, if you've already read the first book, the second book has still got quite a lot in there for you to enjoy. I think for more experienced people, they'll really find the organizational change and the kind of challenges of service design, the sort of stuff towards the end, still very useful. For new people, I think it'd be also really great, because it's a little more grounded in actual kind of case studies and facts and figures and things that we can kind of talk about and saying, we know this and we know that, versus the speculative thing maybe of the first book. So if people want to support us, the best place to buy is actually from the publisher, so from Rosenfeld Media. So if you go to rosenfeldmedia.com, you'll find it there. It launches on October the 21st. So if you pre-order it, you get 15% off, I think. The people who have already bought the first edition from them will also get a discount. And I think they will have already got an email about this to say you can get a discount. So that's the best place to support us. Quite simply, we get a larger cut of the percentage than Amazon, because obviously, as everyone knows, Amazon, chokehold capitalism, Amazon is the place where they're always skimming their cut off first. The books are released, I'm pretty sure they're DRM free. I can't remember now if they've changed that, but there's quite a lot of support material. All the images still are available online. They're on Flickr, actually, amazingly, because the whole Rosenfeld catalogue is old enough now that they had already been putting all the diagrams we had rights to in images onto Flickr as a library for people to look at. So you can kind of blow them up and zoom them in. And they've just carried on. So, Flickr still exists. Who knew?
Wonderful. Hey, thank you so much for sharing a bit of the history behind how the first edition came out and all the backstage work that happened for that spring cleaning. I really appreciate it. And best of luck for the book launch.
Thank you so much. And it's really nice to have that full circle with you of having sort of now you as my colleague and working together. And it's nice to talk to you about this.
Hey, so all the best and see you soon.
Thanks. See you soon.